Does any kind of meaningful change ever take place without a true recognition of the problem or the ingredients that actually caused that problem in the first place? The answer is obvious. No change really takes place. Lasting change, meaningful change, takes place without a recognition of the problems that have caused a need for change. In this session and the next, I want to talk about a fairly short chapter in the book of Psalms attributed to David. But it deals with change, but it deals with the necessity of that recognition. In his translation of the Hebrew in the book of Psalms, Robert Adler says this about the very beginning of that chapter, chapter 38 of Psalms. A Psalm of David, Hebrew says, a Psalm of David, a call to mind. The Hebrew infinitive is anomalous in the superscription of the psalm, appearing here at the beginning of Psalm chapter 70. It may simply refer to the speaker's intention to bring to mind his suffering in his supplication to God. It may also have a connotation of confession. Interesting observation. In fact, if you actually contrast that with what Albert Barnes says in his commentary on the book of Psalms, actually there's a lot of similarity. Here's what he writes. In the very first phrase, the meaning is that it is a good record for a purpose of reminding. That is, of keeping up the remembrance of something which had occurred in his own experience and which might be useful to himself or to others. The record of some valuable lessons which had been learned from what he had experienced in the trials referred to. So in Psalm chapter 38, let's talk about the first half of this. I know I want to talk about the conclusion, and then the next time we're together, we'll pick up where we left off. I really want to deal with verses 1 down through verse number 5. And then we'll skip over and talk about verses 15 through 20. No meaningful change ever takes place without a recognition of what causes the problem. And here's the way it begins. After that inscription, the Psalm of David, to bring to remembrance, here's what he says in verse 1. O Lord, do not rebuke me in your wrath, nor chasten me in your displeasure. And the very statement is an acknowledgement that there are some problems. There have been some errors in his life. He hasn't done exactly what he needed to. He hasn't responded in the ways that really he should have. And because of that, he knows that God is displeased with his life. But actually he begins by begging for mercy. Please don't be that upset with me because I recognize what I've done. That recognition is written all through this chapter. In verse number 2, your arrows pierce me deeply, and your hand presses me down. The recognition, there's a discomfort that he has in his life, and he can't trace that back to somebody else's fault. It's his. The problem in our culture is people are looking for a scapegoat. They're looking for somebody else they can blame. Have you noticed that very few people actually take responsibility for the problems that they create? It's always somebody else's fault. And that's true in almost every aspect of the culture in which we live. It's true of maybe the child who went to school. Well, it's not my fault. My pet ate my homework. But you see that same kind of irresponsibility all the way to the top occupations of power over this nation in which we live. It's not my fault. It's somebody else's. It's always somebody else's to blame. Here's verse 2 again. Your arrows pierce me deeply, and your hand presses me down. It's a recognition that I am actually feeling all of the angst, all of the wrongs and the retribution that could be expected is something I can't blame on somebody else. So the discomfort that he feels in verse number 2 relates to what he finds in what you find in verse number 3. I want to talk about the second half of verse 3. We'll come back to the first part of it first. The entire verse says this: there is no soundness in my flesh because of your anger, nor any health in my bones because of my sin. The second phrase, not any health in my bones because of my sin, it's not just the discomfort, but the distress. And it's a recognition that it's my problem. And if I'm going to have any kind of correction the way that I approach things, I've got to acknowledge whatever role that I may have had in the creation or the continuation of that problem to begin with. In verse number 4, the statement is made, my iniquities have gone over my head like a heavy burden. They are too heavy for me. Depression. But it's a depression that he has brought upon himself. It's not something that was caused by somebody else. It's the old idea that was stated by one of the former presidents a long time ago. The buck stops here. Responsibility stops here. And unfortunately, for several decades, it seems, that's really not been the mantra or the statement or the motive that's been expressed because of problems. Well, I'm doing this, but it's not my fault. Somebody else caused this problem. I can't fix it because somebody else caused the problem. Makes no sense whatsoever. I mean, if I'm making the problem worse, I am to blame. If I'm not providing solutions to something that was present, I am to blame, not somebody else. But that is something that's been spoon-fed to several generations of people in these United States. My iniquities, they're a burden for me, my problem. That's the reason that I'm depressed. In verse number 5, my wounds are foul and festering because of my foolishness. Again, he bears the responsibility. But he's not just talking about discomfort. He's not talking about something that actually accelerates into a distress kind of setting. He's not even talking about the way that he feels depressed. In verse number 5, it's the recognition that the way I have approached my problems, now the way that I have not been owning up to them up to this point in time, there is a emotional, mental, spiritual decay that's taking place, just like you see all around us in this 21st century. And people are looking for all sorts of solutions to those problems, but they're looking in the wrong places. They're looking for solutions that are temporary at best. It makes me feel good for a while, but it doesn't take care of the problem. The problem still exists. Let's go from verse number 5 over to verse number 15. I want to mention this. I want to mention 15 and following again the next time we're together. Verse 15, for in you, O Lord, I hope. What is this hope? That you will hear, Lord my God. For I said, hear me, lest they rejoice over me, lest when my foot slips, they exalt themselves against me. When you start thinking about the position in which David found himself as king over that nation of Israel, individuals that don't like him having that position rather than themselves, and the kind of problems that actually come to bear. So here's David saying, I have a hope that I have latched onto, and I'm not willing to let that hope go. My hope is not in me. That hope is in God. Verse number 17, I'm ready to fall, and my sorrow is continually before me. Therefore I will declare my iniquity. I will be in anguish over my sin. I've got to recognize the problems that I've caused. I will declare my iniquity. I'll be very mournful over what I have done. But my enemies, verse 19, are vigorous. They're strong. Those who hate me wrongfully have multiplied. Those also who render evil for good, they are my adversaries, because I follow what is good. And there's a determination to continue to follow what is good, just in the way that he words these verses. So I hope, continue to hope in God. I will declare, take responsibility for my iniquity. My sorrow, my anguish is something that is very evident in the way that I feel and the way that I take that responsibility. But I am determined to follow what is good. He closes with this statement. Do not forsake me, O Lord. O my God, do not be far from me. Make haste to help me, O Lord, my salvation. No meaningful change without a recognition of what's wrong in the first place. The next time we're together, we're going to pick up with Psalm chapter 38, verse number 6 and following. because David gives us more points to consider as we reflect upon our responsibility not to put the blame on somebody else, but to recognize that we have a responsibility that we must accept for things that we have done that are wrong, and determined to actually follow, as David says, follow what is good. Interesting chapter. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.